Well, thank you so much for being all here today. I apologize for getting here quite late. So today I would like to talk to you about post-Brexit policy and whether or not I think, from the research I've been doing, it will alter the course of farm evolution and farmland management in Welsh uplands. So to do this, I'm going to base myself on some research that I've conducted in Northwest Wales, and particularly focusing on the economic analysis and farming sense analysis of some modeled farming system to have some answers. So I'll quickly take you through maybe what kind of policies we're looking at the future, what Brexit is about, and I will also next tell you a bit about the agrarian diagnosis, and to then go on very rapidly on what kind of farming system we have in the landscape that I'm going to present today, and what kind of economic and environmental performance we're looking at. That will allow me to conclude in the end. So first, we are looking at many changes in the post-Brexit era. So you might have heard about some of them: exports problem, imports problem, and some fluxes that evolve a lot. But we have some new trade deals that are coming over the horizon, new rules on what we can export and how we export. But as well, we are noticing right now some prices changes, either for inputs or outputs, and they're fluctuating very rapidly. And it's very hard to tell whether all this come from Brexit or some comes from COVID. One thing is sure, on the policy side, the things are coming from Brexit. And it's not looking very rosy for Wales, because basically the funding will be from Whitehall and will not necessarily be a long-term commitment, while the Welsh Government is keen to have a long-term commitment for its scheme. So the scheme that they want to set out is about first maybe standards, retaining standards in agriculture, and as well as trying to set up a farm-based scheme to farm-based scheme with an analysis and some solutions that will be given to each individual farms to reach multiple scale sustainability, including economic, social, society, from the society scale, but also environmental, or from the cultural point of view, which is very interesting. But apart from that, it is yet very unclear what they plan to do, for example, on the supply chain, or it's very likely that there will be nothing on the land in terms of land market. The agrarian diagnosis. So the agrarian diagnosis, it's an in-depth study where you study a small agricultural area in detail. You spend a lot of time on the area, you're trying to understand it very well by combining a successive analysis of the landscape, the history, and the technical and economical functioning of farms and farmland management in the area. So I spent a lot of time in North Wales to do this. Many interviews, very long interviews, to characterize in detail how farms function and function through time in relation to the landscape. So today we are focusing on more on the technical and economical side, and to get there, the important bit is that I usually, to get to modeled farm, you pool farm together. So you pool farm that will have similar farming system, similar equation of their farming system in terms of use of their resource to get to the same output or similar output, which in the end will give a production system, which is a characteristic combination of cropping system, livestock system, and all the processes. Economic, but also from the agronomy point of view. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So let's have a quick look at the economics of the economic analysis out of the agrarian diagnosis. So usually out of a farm you will produce some food or other outputs. So you have a total output value, which is a raw product. It's a green box, the green line, and inside it you will have some intermediate consumption, which will be the cost of all your inputs, some investment depreciation, the cost of all your infrastructure and tools that you will have used in the process of production, and finally to get the added value, meaning the economic value that you will have created out of the process of producing food or any other good. To get to the agricultural revenue, which is in blue, you will have to take out the rent taxes and every salary that you've paid to people in your farm, but add the subsidies that you will get. Right. So now that with the agrarian diagnosis you have this view from an average year from the farmer's point of view. So this will be the basis of the analysis today, from a family farm point of view on an average year. So we're going straight to North Wales, where I work was around Bala, so you can see it's just near Snowdonia National Park, it's part of it. Very picturesque area, very an upland with a lot of mountainous area. So on this I'm picking 4 of my around 20 farm models to a bit show you what kind of farm production type we have and what kind of economic and technical impact it has and what kind of environmental impact we're looking at. So I gave them letters A, B, C, D. So if we're looking at letter A, it's a mountain farm on rough grazing. It's a relatively big mountain farm, but look at the number of sheep, 1,000 sheep. It's a relatively low number of sheep with only one person working on the farm. No inputs, but as well no reclaimed land. The land is not improved. You virtually don't have grassland. You cannot go with a tractor on all of this land. Imagine how tough it is as a landscape to farm. And at the same time, you have to do everything by foot or with dogs. You cannot implement the work productivity package of the 20th century agricultural revolution, which is very impressive when it comes to think of it. And you're selling store lamps that have a very low value in the market when you bring them in the market. System B is a more mixed farm with some hill land of better quality, better production. I can go with a tractor, I can cut it, sometimes I can plow it, as well as some mountain land of the same quality as the first system. So we see that we have different kind of animals, better kind of animals, better production, more meaty breeds, and we have a mix of fat and stores that will be produced out of this farm. And we see that here we have some cattle that are usually slightly more demanding than sheep on this. We have a bit more of an input use, but very little fertilizer, very little concentrate, boughten feed for the animals, and we have a bit more people working on the farm, but only slightly more. Then we're moving to system C, which is very different, because first, look at the size of it, 40 hectares, very small compared to the 2 first, and it's only hill land, meaning it doesn't have access to the mountain, and it went to specialize into hens farming and sheep farming. If you have a look, hens will be the biggest activity on this farm, and the sheep are really here to use the land more than anything else, graze the grass. You don't have so many hens compared to what an average hens farm will have, and this farm is using a lot of input, but mind you, no fertilizer, only boughten feed for the hens. And finally, we will have system D, which is a dairy farm in the lowland part of the landscape, in the valley floor. We have a different system. It's relatively big, it has a large number of dairy cows, but they're relatively small, spring calving cows. But compared to all the other farms that we've seen, particularly the leftmost one, A and B, it has a high fertilizer and high concentrate use, even if it's a relatively savvy farm in terms of dairy farm. Right, so we're looking all of these systems, apart from system C, which is not linked to the land because it buys nearly all its food, at farms which production is totally linked with the environmental growth, like the growth from the grass growth cycle in the upland. That means peak production cycle will be around April time, May time, and June time, when you have the most growth on the farm. That's what we're looking at. So if we start looking at the economic value out of it, first thing is, let's look at the output of the farm and how it's spread into our different boxes. So if we look at it, we realize that we have clear difference in terms of land productivity when on this landscape. So you see that only when you have only mountain land, you have virtually no output out of the land, and you have very little costs, but you're producing so little out of the land in economic value because store lands are worth very little. It's difficult. Then you move to beef and sheep, and it's the same story, even if what you're producing has a tiny more value on the market because you're producing fat and strong stores, well, it's still not great, and it's still not a high output per hectare when you compare to the dairy farm to the right. And when you start to look at the added value, the economic value creation in green, you realize that the only systems that produce economic value tend to be the ones that are on high input production with the highest with the highest environmental impact. So when we look at the per worker figure, you can see that things are more leveled out, but it's still in terms of output per worker. But you still see that it's the farm that is on mountain land is losing a lot of money. It's destroying economic value when it's farming the land, because of what it's producing is worthless or considered worthless by the market. It's not worthless to me, and I think it has a lot of cultural value. And you see clearly the gradation in terms of farming system that we have here. If you look at the farming system here, it's a bit of a specific end system, because this farm has very high input cost, because it buys all of its food from outside, which is a bit difficult in terms of costs. That's why it's so high in terms of cost, intermediate consumption. So if I was asking you who has the highest income in the end, you would say to me that will be the dairy farm, because it has a very high added value. It produces a lot of economic money. It produces a lot of economic value. And I would say to you, you're wrong. It's not necessarily this one that will have the highest added value. Agricultural revenue, agricultural income. Because when you start looking at things from the family worker point of view, you realize that subsidy play a very important role for the mountain farms, but not so much for the hill and lowland farms that do not have such a big acreage of land compared to the left farms. So you can clearly see that the two systems that are ends and dairy make most of their money, most of their income comes from the farm, while it's not the case for the beef and sheep farm on the mountain or that have mountain land, and it's very difficult. But the question is it purely normal? You question when you see that with Brexit we will probably remove most of the first pillar payment, the green payments. We are going below the threshold in terms of acceptable or minimum wage for a lot of farming systems, and there are a lot of questions about what we will give in the future. Because if we start looking at the blue subsidy, which is what the Welsh Government wants the future subsidy to be based on, or the dark green, because it's what farms will have to produce to be sustainable on their own right, not depending on subsidy, we can clearly see that it will be very complicated, or nigh impossible, and it will clearly call for some changes. And it's even worse when I start looking at all the farming system in Bala area. There are many systems that without subsidy will not be able to subsist in the land, or will have to go out of farming, or to rent out the land, or to retire, to have an additional income, or to start working part-time. And we're not talking only about beef and sheep farms. Smaller dairy farms to the left here will also be impacted. But the most problem we would have would be in the hills, where people do not have mountain land and have very little environmental subsidy in light blue. And that's where we're looking at for the very big problem is the post-cap subsidy. We're at risk of losing many hill farms, or seeing relatively high input system developing in the uplands, either on dairying, on ends, and that do not necessarily are fully linked to the goal of sustainable intensification that we want to see. So, in the future, we're looking at... It's time to conclude this presentation. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope I've shown you that we have very different economics for farming system that depend a lot of where you farm in the landscape. You are not able to do what you want to do. You are locked into paths, depending on where you are, depending on your situations. Be it on the farming system or the much talked about diversifications. People on Snowdonia do not have the same opportunities for diversifications due to planning concerns compared to people outside of the national park. We also clearly understand that if we are not very careful about the subsidy and what we do in the future with it, farmers will go for security. And what is security right now? Security right now is going for high added value type of farming that you will plan on a relatively long term, 20, 30 years, where you lock yourself into a production. For example, dairy, hens, rearing heifers, where you have to go for relatively high investments. Those can have consequences for the environment, or can have consequences for farmers that might not be able to go into the future scheme from the Welsh Government. So we have to give security, we have to be sure that everyone is included, so as to not to lose too many farms, going out of farming for lack of income, but as well too many systems that would farm the land in a sustainable way. There's a big question as well when you talk about new entrants into farming. And when you talk about new entrants into farming, the economics are such that it's really unlikely that they will ever get onto any other production than high added value production. Or they will have to do a part-time job or something else aside of the farm. But even then, it's not sure that they would be able to get there due to the amount of cash needed. So we have a clear concern or the link between the environment and the functioning of farm and what could happen in the future. And you clearly understand that it's not all linked to the future of the subsidy. We have the whole environment around farms that is important, the land market, but also the actual markets and how they function and what kind of products farmers can bring to the market. This is a multifaceted challenge that is ahead of us, and the stakes are enormous. We can lose many farmers, or we can succeed in doing an agroecological transition.